welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. So glad you joined us again tonight. Well, if you've been watching my videos, you'll know that I made a whole bunch of bone broth right after Thanksgiving. And I'm going to can it up for you now, or some of it. It would get repetitive if I canned it all. But I can quite a bit of bone broth between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and then I use it in my cooking all year. A couple things I want to mention. Our Facebook group, Safe Canning by the Book on Debbie's Back Porch, is a safe canning group. We use the resources only from National Center for Home Food Preservation, Ball, and Bernardin. And when you see me can in a video, I'm sticking to tested recipes and methods. We do not believe that it's a safe practice to make up your own recipes. We believe that there are plenty of really good recipes and methods for you to use that have been tested for safety. So when you're watching a video and somebody says, now, this is not approved by the National Center or the USDA, so do it at your own risk, that means that there's a risk. So canning is something that I do to preserve the harvest and to create safe, preserved food for my family and friends. And I just don't want to be cutting corners. Canning is not to create convenience food. Canning is to create or to safely preserve ingredients for future cooking. So I say all the time, cooking is art, canning is science. So we'll try to stick to the science. There are no canning police, so you do as you like in your own kitchen. But if what you want is the safe tested methods, then we'll do that. Here is the lovely bone broth that I've made that we're going to can. I have close to 8 quarts, and I'm only going to, and then I have about 6 quarts of beef broth. I've been using it almost as fast as I make it. So I'm only going to go through one cycle of this with you, one canner full, but this will go on for several days. So when you're canning, the first thing for you to do is to get all of your equipment together, and I'm going to go over that and show you the equipment and the process. Be right back. Okay, I try generally to have everything ready and together before I start the process. So I'll show you how I do it. I have my broth here. I'm going to pour it into, it's had the fat removed and cleaned. That's all in my previous video when I made the turkey broth. I'm going to put this in a pot and heat it back up. Right now it's still cold. There's my funnel. This is what I use as a debubbler. My jar lifter. A big old scoop. And the magnetic wand. Make sure you get all those out. Here are my lids. They have been washed. If you'll notice, I'm not simmering them. These are Golden Harvest lids, which are made by Jarden, same company as Ball. And I have many Ball and Golden Harvest jars. You hear my dog in the background. That's not a pig, that's my dog. That's Bobby. And just a note, apparently there was a lot of misunderstanding about a quote-unquote change in the lids. There was no change in the lids. And I mean, I've been using the lids all along. I never saw a change. All that changed was that in their testing, Ball found that the lids work just as well not simmered as they do simmered. And by the way, they never should have been boiled. It was always simmered. And there was no change in the amount of time that they're good for. It's always been recommended in my memory, and I've been canning since the 70s, that a safe period for quality in your food Canned food is 1 year. That doesn't mean that it's not safe to eat after 1 year if it was processed correctly and that it has remained sealed. It just means that the quality is less as time goes on, and for maximum quality in your food, you should try to use it within a year. And I often wonder why you would want food that was not good quality when you've gone to all the trouble to can it safely. So in case somebody told you, oh, they're only good for a year, that's not true. They're good as long as they stay sealed and there's been no change in the lids. But it's always been a best practice to try to plan your canning so that you use your food within 1 year. If you go 18 months, you go 18 months. You're not going to drop dead from it. But your food loses quality. So you're aiming for planning your canning so that you use your food up within a year. Moving on, I have here a roaster full of hot water, and I put my hot jars in there and partially fill them with hot water, and I hold them that way. And I almost forgot, I have my rings, I have a little bowl of vinegar, and I have a roll of paper towels. It's my practice to wipe the inside of the rings, even though they've been washed and I know they're clean, to wipe them with vinegar. I have found that eliminates any little unseen specks of rust or dirt that might keep your jar from sealing. So I do recommend doing that, even though I've never seen it written anywhere. It has just worked for me. So we're going to heat up this broth and get the process started. I'll be back. Okay, I've been filling jars. I have 4 already in the canner. Take the hot jar. Fill it with the hot broth. This broth has not been clarified. This is how it came right out of the roaster, strained, and then I took the fat off. So, if you want to clarify it, you can. There's a method called using an egg raft. But I use mine for cooking, so I don't really care if it's been clarified. This is actually pretty clear. Okay, 1 inch headspace. Wipe the rim with vinegar. Place your lid carefully. These are the rings that I wiped the inside out. They were washed, and then I wiped the inside out with vinegar. The lid is finger tight. You don't want it any tighter than that because the jar needs to vent during processing, and then it'll vent the air out, and after you take it out of the canner and the jar cools, it will suck a vacuum. That's the ping that you hear. You may not always hear the ping. And with broth, it may ping 20 times. Broth will go pop, 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 pop. And you just leave it alone. And after 12 to 24 hours, then you can take the ring off. I'll do one more for you. Sorry, steamy. So, if you'll remember, or maybe you don't know, you do 1 jar at a time. You have a hot jar, you have hot broth, you have hot water in your canner, You do 1 jar at a time to prevent thermal shock. If you took 7 jars, filled them up, put the lids on them, and then put them all in the canner, the first jar would be too cold. I'm down to the middle, to the end here. I'm not quite at 1 inch. I'm going to get my other pot. Be right back. Should have used my bigger stock pot. Okay, that's at the inch. And yes, I'm fairly picky about that. I mean, there's a reason that you're given a specific headspace. And the headspace for this is 1 inch. I'm going to show you that finger tight one more time because it's important. You don't want to crank it down too hard. It'll cause your lid to buckle. Okay, I'm going to finish up here and then be back to you. Okay, I have all 7 quarts in and I've just turned the heat up on my canner. And this is the vinegar that I had left. This is an All-American 921. It holds 7 quarts, or I think 16 pints. Maybe 18 pints, I don't remember. And you tighten it on opposite sides so that you get a level fit. I love the All-American, but I've used Presto and Miro. They all work just fine. Y'all excuse my bruised arm. I had a fight with a chicken yesterday and she won. Okay, this is ready to go. Now, I always do my canning videos assuming that you're a beginner, and so I may say things that you already know. The All-American has both a dial gauge and a weighted gauge stem. The process here is I had the water simmering. I put the hot jars in. I turned the heat up. We're going to wait for it to start venting out of this hole. And then we will put our gauge on set for 10 pounds. And then I'll take you through the rest of the steps. If you don't live under 1,000 feet elevation, then you need to check your elevation and check on National Center for Home Food Preservation for the directions on what pressure you should use. And it varies if you're using a canner with just a dial gauge or a canner with a weight gauge. So on the All-American you have both, and as it happens this dial gauge is calibrated perfectly But I don't have to depend on the dial gauge because I have a weight regulator, and I'm under 1,000 pounds, so I can use 10 pounds. Anything over that elevation, I'm under 1,000 feet, so I can use 10 pounds. Anything over 1,000 feet, and you would switch to the 15-pound gauge. Go away. We'll leave this. I will come back when it starts venting and show you the next step in the process. Our canner is venting. I'm sure you can't see it. Maybe you can see the plume of steam that's coming out. Maybe not, but you can hear it. So when you get a good vent, a solid plume of steam, set your timer for 10 minutes. This gives the canner time to vent the excess air out so that it can create a vacuum and raise the temperature above 212. That's why you have to have a pressure canner for low acid foods, because when this canner reaches 10 pounds of pressure, the temperature inside the canner is 240 degrees. A water bath canner never gets above 212, and you could boil your food for hours and hours in a water bath canner and it still not be safe. The temperature you need to make sure that the pathogens are killed is 240. So that's why you must do this in a pressure canner. We'll come back in 10 minutes. We have 1 minute left on the venting. So I'm going to show you the gauge. Your gauge may be different. If you have a Presto, you have, looks like a little knob with a couple of rings on it. The Miro is different still. This is a gauge that shows 5, 10, or 15 pounds. And as soon as the timer goes off, which will be any second now, we'll drop it on the 10-pound weight. There we go, 10 pounds. Now we go away again and we wait for this to begin to rattle. That will show that we're up to actually 11, but actually 11 pounds weight on the gauge. We'll be back. Well, we are coming up on 11 pounds pressure, and we're starting to get a rattle from our weight. As soon as it gives me a good rattle, which should be any second now, I'm going to turn my temperature down, my heat down. Excuse my dogs, they live here too. I'm going to turn the heat down to 4. That's 4 out of 9. My sweet spot on this stove is around 4, 3, but I'm going to go on down to 4 and immediately, not wait for a long rattle. Now what I mean by the sweet spot is the lowest possible temperature to maintain your pressure properly. If you've been working with a dial gauge, you've already found that. But if you're working with a weighted gauge, some folks just leave it on high and let it rattle. And then they let it rattle hard. And then they wonder why they get siphoning out of their jars. You want to minimize your temperature changes while you're canning because that's one of the things that causes siphoning. So as soon as you reach your pressure, go ahead and turn down your heat to the temperature that you have learned will maintain that pressure. So this should rattle about 2, 3, 4 times a minute. I have a gauge to double check, but what you want is for this to just ride on the steam, not to rattle and let the steam escape. So we're going to come back and check on this. First I have to set my timer. Broth processes at 20 minutes pints, 25 minutes quarts. Now that's clear broth or broth with a few tiny pieces of meat in it. The directions on National Center for Home Food Preservation say specifically tiny bits of meat. I talked to the Extension Service and asked them to clarify that, and they said about a tablespoonful. So they really mean a tiny amount if you are processing at broth time. If you want to process more meat than that, as long as it is less than half a jar full, meaning you put in the meat no more than half full in the jar, and then add broth, you can process that for soup times, not meat times, because there are no times that allow you to safely can fully cooked meat. So broth has a very low time because there's no density. It heats up quickly. The kill time for any pathogens is short. When you start adding meat to it, then your time increases. And I'll say again, there is no recipe for a jar full of fully cooked meat in broth. Half a jar is your limit, and you use soup times. We'll come back in 25 minutes. Okay, there's our timer. Timer off, heat off. Now we go away and leave it alone until our temperature gauge is down to 0. Well, our pressure's down to 0 on our pressure gauge. If you've watched my videos about canning before, you know all Americans seem to hold a little tiny bit of pressure still, even after the gauge is down to 0. So I let it loose very carefully and very slowly. Now, one thing that comes up pretty often on our canning group is, can I just go off and leave this overnight and get it out in the morning? No. The heat up, cool down time are all figured in the safety of the canning process. When the pressure's down to 0, you got a little while, 10-15 minutes or so, but you don't need to leave it sit overnight, because there are organisms that are not killed by the canning process, thermophilic organisms that can cause food loss. They're not deadly, but they can cause you to lose your food. One is called flat sour. So we now have our weight off. We're going to wait 10 more minutes before we take the lid off. And we'll come back. Okay, it's been 10 minutes, so we're going to take our lid off. Open it away from you. And let's see what we've got. There's pop. As I said a minute ago with broth, it can pop back and forth several times. The first time I made broth, I thought I did something wrong. This is bad. Oh my goodness. And I threw it out. And then somebody told me, nope, that's just the nature of broth. It's very thin, no density at all. There is a heating, cooling that's happening. So don't panic. Well, that's some pretty broth if I do say so myself. It's very dark. The bone broth gets darker than, say, if you just made some chicken broth from fresh chicken. This was cooked 36 hours slowly, and then the bones were crushed and it cooked another 12 hours. So that's why you have the dark color. One thing I'll have you notice, there is no siphoning in these jars. I didn't lose any. And that's from the combination of finger tight lids, finding the sweet spot and not overcooking, taking the weight off and letting it sit 10 minutes before you take the lid off. Those are the things that if you're having trouble with siphoning, those are the things you want to examine. So we want to leave this totally alone for 12 to 24 hours. By then, the jars will be sealed. If not, we'll either refrigerate it or reprocess it, and we'll take the bands off, wash the jars, label the broth. And it's very important to label broth like this because, gee, you can't look at that and see it's not beef broth. So we'll wash the jars, label the lids, put them away, and have some yummy goodness for months to come. Thank you for joining us on Debbie's Back Porch for safe canning turkey broth. We'll see you tomorrow.